Welcome back to Infidelity Tales Lab. We're incredibly grateful for your support. Before we begin today's tale, tell us, which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. The crystal glasses clinked against each other as servers weaved through the crowd of Boston's elite. Their black bow ties and crisp white shirts a stark contrast to the opulent evening wear of the guests. Abel Ingram stood at the center of his historic Beacon Hill Homes Grand Salon, accepting congratulations with a practiced smile. The $300 million Performing Arts Center contract should have been the pinnacle of his career, yet something felt off about this celebration. His wife, Allison Ritter, floated through the room like a queen holding court. Her champagne flute barely touched as she orchestrated the perfect evening. Her silver dress caught the light from the antique chandeliers, making her seem to shimmer as she moved from group to group, her laugh tinkling like the finest crystal. "Abel, darling," Allison called out, beckoning him over to a cluster of important guests. The mayor was just asking about the acoustic design elements. He excused himself from a conversation with two board members and made his way across the room, noting how the hardwood floors gleamed beneath the guests' feet. Allison had had them specially polished for tonight. Every detail was perfect, as always. "Mr. Mayor," Abel said, shaking hands with the distinguished gentleman. "I was just reviewing the final plans for the concert hall's acoustic ceiling yesterday. We're implementing a revolutionary design that..." A movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Through the French doors leading to the conservatory, he spotted his mother-in-law, Betty Muller, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Sylvia Sexton, the Arts Center's board director. Betty's normally composed face was pinched with concern, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing emphatically. "Excuse me just a moment," Abel murmured, drifting closer to the conservatory while maintaining the appearance of mingling. He pretended to examine a particularly fine orchid arrangement as fragments of their conversation floated toward him. "The DNA results cannot see the light of day, Sylvia." Betty's usually controlled voice held an edge of panic. "We must ensure they remain sealed. Have you considered the implications for the families involved?" Sylvia's response was too low to catch, but her expression was grave as she gripped Betty's arm. The two women moved further into the conservatory, their voices dropping to whispers. Abel felt a hand on his arm and turned to find Charles Wellington, one of his firm's senior partners, beaming at him. "There's our man of the hour. Tell me, Abel, how does it feel to have landed the biggest architectural contract in Boston this decade?" "Incredible," Abel replied automatically, his mind still on the strange exchange he'd witnessed. "We're very fortunate to have this opportunity." Throughout the remainder of the evening, Abel found his attention repeatedly drawn to Betty and Sylvia. They had separated after their conversation in the conservatory, but he noticed them exchanging meaningful glances across the room. Betty seemed to have aged years in the space of an evening, the lines around her mouth deeper than usual. As the party wound down and the last guest departed into the cool Boston night, Allison began directing the cleanup crew with military precision. Abel wandered into his study, ostensibly to review some contracts, but really to think about what he'd overheard. "Darling, aren't you coming to bed?" Allison appeared in the doorway, her perfect makeup still flawless despite the late hour. "It's been such a wonderful evening. Everything went exactly according to plan." Abel looked at his wife of 15 years, trying to reconcile the polished society wife before him with the young woman he'd fallen in love with in college. "Yes, perfect as always," he said, closing his laptop. "I'll be up in a minute." After Allison left, Abel opened his browser and typed Sylvia Sexton Boston into the search bar. The results were impressive: board positions, charity work, social appearances. But one link caught his eye. Sexton Fertility Clinic celebrates 25 years of success. The article was from 3 years ago, featuring a photo of Sylvia in a white coat, standing proudly in front of a modern medical facility. Abel's breath caught as he read further. The clinic was known for its high success rate with IVF treatments, catering to Boston's most prestigious families, including, if he remembered correctly, his own. Allison had never liked to talk about their fertility treatments, but he distinctly remembered her mentioning she'd gone to the best clinic in Boston. He clicked through to the clinic's website, noting the tasteful design and impressive list of credentials. But it was that About Us page that made his blood run cold. There was Sylvia again, but this time the photo was older, and standing next to her was a much younger Betty Muller, identified as the clinic's former administrative director. The pieces began falling into place, but the picture they formed made no sense. Why would Betty and Sylvia be discussing DNA results at his celebration party? And what implications for which families? Abel closed the browser and sat in the darkness of his study, listening to the sounds of his house settling for the night. Somewhere above, Allison was probably already asleep, her face covered in expensive night cream, her silver dress carefully hung away. Their life together was perfect, too perfect perhaps. A memory surfaced. Allison's pregnancy with the twins had been surprisingly easy after their struggles to conceive. Betty had been overjoyed, practically moving in with them during the first trimester. At the time, Abel had attributed her hovering to normal grandmother excitement. But now, he pulled out his phone and created a new note, Sylvia Sexton, fertility clinic connection. Betty, former director, DNA results, which families? Then he added one more line. Why were they really at the party tonight? The celebration that should have marked his greatest professional triumph had instead planted the seeds of suspicion that would ultimately unravel everything he thought he knew about his life. The Sunday morning sun filtered through the leaded glass windows of Abel's study, casting prismatic patterns across his desk. He'd been up since dawn, unable to shake the unease that had taken root during Friday's party. The house was quiet. Allison was at her weekly tennis match, followed by brunch with her society friends, a routine as predictable as the turning of the earth. Abel had spent the morning researching Sylvia Sexton's fertility clinic, making careful notes about its history and connections to Boston's elite families. The clinic's patient list read like a who's who of New England society, though specific names were never mentioned in the press releases he found. Privacy, it seemed, was paramount. A sound from the house's old ventilation system caught his attention, voices carrying through the metal ducts from the sitting room below. Betty's distinctive tone was immediately recognizable, though he'd had no idea she was in the house. She must have used her key to let herself in, something she did with increasing frequency lately. Lisa, you have to keep quiet. Betty's voice was urgent, lacking its usual polish. The girls are from when you and James were in Paris, not from the IVF. Abel's pen clattered to the desk. He sat perfectly still, barely breathing, straining to hear more. No, you don't understand, Betty continued, her voice rising with frustration. If this gets out, it won't just destroy Allison's marriage. Think about the other families at the clinic. Think about what Sylvia has been covering up all these years. The world tilted on its axis. Abel gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. The twins, Kelsey and Christy, his 15-year-old daughters, weren't from IVF? James? Paris? His mind raced through the timeline. Allison had studied art history in Paris during their engagement, while he was finishing his master's degree in Boston. She'd mentioned running into James, an old college friend, but Betty's voice dropped lower, and Abel found himself moving silently to the floor vent, pressing his ear closer. The DNA results are conclusive, Lisa. James has no idea how many times. Yes, I know Sylvia promised it would never come out, but no, destroying the records isn't enough anymore. There are too many connections, too many families involved. The conversation continued, but Abel had heard enough. He returned to his desk and opened his laptop with trembling hands. In a private browser window, he searched for James Paris art dealer and found several hits for James Laurent, owner of multiple prestigious galleries in Paris and New York. The man's photo showed a striking resemblance to his twins. The same azure eyes, the same sharp cheekbones that Abel had always attributed to Allison's side of the family. His next search was for private investigators in Boston. He needed someone discreet, someone who wouldn't be connected to the social circles that seemed increasingly poisonous. Two names stood out: Randolph Ramsey, known for handling sensitive domestic cases, and Corey Marr, who specialized in medical fraud investigations. Abel sent carefully worded emails to both, requesting urgent consultations. While waiting for responses, he pulled up photos of the twins on his phone. Kelsey and Christy smiled back at him from their latest school portraits, their features suddenly foreign to him. How had he never seen it before? The way Christy tilted her head in photos, the particular arch of Kelsey's eyebrows. These weren't his genetic legacies at all. His phone buzzed. Ramsey had responded, offering to meet that afternoon at a quiet coffee shop in Cambridge. Mar's reply came minutes later, suggesting a meeting the following morning. Abel confirmed both appointments, then sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The sound of the front door opening jolted him from his thoughts. Allison's voice drifted up the stairs, accompanied by the click of her tennis shoes on the hardwood floors. "Betty, are you still here? I saw your car outside." "Just leaving, darling," Betty called back, her voice now perfectly composed, as if she hadn't just shattered Abel's world moments ago. "I dropped off those auction catalogs you wanted to review." Abel listened to their casual exchange, marveling at the layers of deception. How long had this been going on? How many other families were involved in whatever scheme Sylvia had been running at the clinic? That afternoon, Abel sat across from Randolph Ramsey in a back corner of the coffee shop, studying the investigator's weathered face. Ramsey had the look of a man who had seen too much of human nature's darker side, but had somehow maintained his humanity. "Mr. Ingram," Ramsey said, his voice low and professional, "before you tell me what brought you here, I want you to understand something. Once we start pulling threads, there's no telling what might unravel. Are you prepared for that?" Abel thought of the perfect life he believed he had just days ago. The successful firm, the beautiful wife, the talented daughters, the historic home. All of it built on lies. "I need to know the truth, Mr. Ramsey. All of it." He slid a manila envelope across the table containing photos of James Laurent, Betty, Sylvia, and a list of dates and connections he'd compiled. "I need to know about my wife's time in Paris 15 years ago, specifically her connection to this man. I need to know about Sylvia Sexton's fertility clinic and any irregular practices they might have engaged in. And I need to know what role my mother-in-law played in all of it." Ramsey examined the contents of the envelope carefully, his expression revealing nothing. "This goes beyond a simple infidelity case, doesn't it?" "I believe it does," Abel replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I think there's a larger conspiracy involving the fertility clinic and possibly multiple families. That's why I'm also meeting with Corey Marr tomorrow. I need someone who understands medical fraud." "Wise decision," Ramsey nodded. "I'll start with surveillance and background checks. Paris records from 15 years ago might take time, but I have contacts there. Do you want your wife to know she's being investigated?" "No," Abel said firmly. "No one can know. Not yet. I need to understand what we're dealing with first." The investigator made some notes in a small notebook. "And the children? Do you want DNA testing?" Abel's throat tightened. Yes, but it needs to be done carefully. If what I suspect is true, there are other families involved who might be affected by what we discover." "I understand," Ramsey said, closing his notebook. "I'll begin immediately. Expect daily reports via secure email." "And Mr. Ingram?" He caught Abel's eye. "Be careful. People who orchestrate this kind of deception usually have a lot to lose. They won't take kindly to exposure." Abel walked back to his car, his mind spinning with possibilities. He had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped now. As he drove home, he thought about the Performing Arts Center contract that had seemed so important just days ago. Now it felt like a prop in an elaborate stage production, just like everything else in his life. When he arrived home, he found Allison in the kitchen, arranging flowers from her garden. She looked up with a smile that once would have warmed his heart. "There you are. I was thinking we should have the Sextons over for dinner next week." Sylvia mentioned at the party that she'd love to discuss some ideas for the Art Center's interior design. Abel studied his wife's face, searching for any sign of the deception that must lie beneath her perfect exterior. "Sure," he said casually, "that sounds fine. How was tennis?" "Oh, you know how it is," Allison laughed, adjusting a rose in the arrangement. "Caroline still can't serve to save her life, but she makes up for it with the latest gossip." He watched her hands move among the flowers, remembering how those same hands had held their daughters. No, her daughters for the first time. Had she known even then? Had she looked at their tiny features and seen James instead of him? "I'll be in my study," he said, turning away before his expression could betray him. "I have some calls to make about the project." "Don't work too hard," Allison called after him. Remember, we have the twins' recital this weekend. Abel closed his study door and leaned against it, closing his eyes. The recital. He would have to sit there and pretend everything was normal while knowing that his entire life was a carefully constructed lie. But first, he had another meeting tomorrow with Corey Marr, and hopefully the beginning of some answers. The morning light barely penetrated the tinted windows of Corey Marr's office in downtown Boston. The medical fraud investigator sat behind a desk cluttered with files and multiple computer monitors, her sharp eyes fixed on Abel as she processed everything he'd told her. Dr. Molly Benton, Marr said, typing the name into her database. She was the physician who supposedly performed your wife's IVF procedure. She frowned at whatever appeared on her screen. Mr. Ingram, are you aware that Dr. Benton died 3 years ago? Abel leaned forward. What? No, I had no idea. How did she die? According to the records, it was a car accident in Paris. Marr's fingers flew across the keyboard. Single vehicle collision on a clear night. Body was cremated immediately, which is interesting. Paris again, Abel muttered. Can you find out who handled her replacement at the clinic? Dr. Sandy Richard took over her patients. Marr replied, pulling up another screen. But here's where it gets strange. In the past 3 years, there's been an unusual pattern of record destruction at the clinic. Medical records are required by law to be maintained for at least 7 years, but numerous files have been accidentally corrupted or lost, particularly those from the period when your wife was a patient. Abel shared what Randolph Ramsey had uncovered so far about James Lawrence movements during the relevant time period. He was in Paris when Dr. Benton died, he noted. His gallery opened an exclusive showing the same week. Mr. Ingram, Marr said carefully, I think we need to talk to someone who worked at the clinic during that period. Someone who might have witnessed what was really going on. As if on cue, Marr's phone buzzed. She checked the message and smiled grimly. Perfect timing. One of my contacts just confirmed that a former laboratory technician from the clinic is willing to meet with us. Her name is Johanna Aldrich, and she's been trying to blow the whistle on some irregular practices for years, but nobody would listen. 2 hours later, Abel sat in a quiet booth at a diner in Somerville, across from a nervous-looking woman in her 50s. Johanna Aldrich's hands trembled slightly as she stirred her coffee, her eyes constantly darting to the door. I shouldn't be here, she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. If Sylvia finds out I'm talking to you... Corey Marr leaned forward, her professional demeanor somehow reassuring. Ms. Aldrich, everything you tell us is protected. We need to understand what was really happening at that clinic. Johanna took a deep breath, then reached into her worn leather bag and pulled out a small notebook. I kept records, she said. Not the official ones, my own observations. Things that didn't add up. She flipped through the pages, filled with cramped handwriting. It started small. Discrepancies in the donor records. Test results that didn't match their paperwork. But then I noticed something else. She looked directly at Abel for the first time. Did you know that Sylvia and Betty aren't just friends? They're sisters. The revelation hit Abel like a physical blow. Sisters? But they have different last names, different backgrounds. All carefully constructed, Johanna explained. The clinic has been in their family for generations, but they've hidden their connection. It gave them more social mobility, more ability to manipulate things. She glanced around nervously again before continuing. Their grandmother started the clinic in the 1950s, specializing in helping Boston's elite families with fertility issues. But it wasn't just medical help they were providing. Marr was taking careful notes. What do you mean? They were engineering social connections, Johanna said, her voice dropping even lower. Controlling which families were connected through marriages, through children. The IVF treatments were just one part of it. They would manipulate test results, arrange chance meetings between certain people, even influence who got appointed to which boards or committees. Abel thought about his own introduction to Allison, how perfectly their social circles had aligned. The miracle pregnancies, he said slowly. They weren't miracles at all, were they? Johanna shook her head. Dr. Benton was getting suspicious. She started asking questions about the donor records, about why certain patterns kept appearing in the genetic profiles. Then she went to Paris for a conference, and she swallowed hard. Well, you know what happened to her? And Dr. Richard? Marr prompted. brought in specifically by Sylvia. She didn't ask questions, just did what she was told. Started destroying records systematically, but making it look like routine cleanup or computer errors. Johanna's hands were shaking so badly now that she had to set down her coffee cup. But there's more. The DNA profiles, they weren't just random donors. They were using specific samples to create particular family connections. James Loron wasn't just a donor. He was part of their plan. Abel felt the blood drain from his face. How many families? I don't know the exact number, Johanna admitted. But it wasn't just in Boston. There were connections to clinics in Paris and New York. It was like they were building their own aristocracy, controlling who was related to whom, who held power where. Mar pulled out a photo of Dr. Benton. Did she keep any records of her suspicions? Johanna nodded slowly. She gave me a key, right before she left for Paris. Said if anything happened to her, I should wait 3 years, then check a storage unit in Cambridge. She pulled out a small key and placed it on the table. I was too scared to use it. But maybe you can? Abel stared at the key, his mind racing with implications. His perfect life, his marriage, his children, all part of some grand design orchestrated by Betty and Sylvia. But why? What was the ultimate goal of all this manipulation? There's one more thing, Johanna said, her voice barely a whisper now. The night Dr. Benton died, Sylvia was in Paris too. She wasn't supposed to be. She had a board meeting scheduled in Boston that she suddenly canceled. I saw her rushing out of the clinic that afternoon, looking worried. The next morning, we got the news about the accident. Mar and Abel exchanged glances. Ms. Aldrich, Mar said carefully, would you be willing to make a formal statement about all of this? Before Johanna could answer, the diner's door chimed. She looked up, her face going pale. Sylvia Sexton stood in the entrance, her elegant figure silhouetted against the bright street behind her. Their eyes met across the room, and Johanna began to tremble violently. I have to go, she gasped, gathering her things quickly. I'm sorry. I can't. Just take the key. But be careful. They're always watching, always one step ahead. She slid out of the booth and hurried toward the back exit, leaving Abel and Mar sitting with the small key that might unlock the truth about decades of deceit. Through the front window, Abel watched Sylvia get into a black SUV with tinted windows. As it pulled away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much darker conspiracy than he'd imagined. His phone buzzed, a text from Allison. Don't forget we're having dinner with Betty tonight. She says she has something important to discuss about the Arts Center project. Abel looked at the key in his hand, then at Mar. How quickly can we get into that storage unit? I'll have a locksmith meet us there in an hour, she replied, already dialing. But Mr. Ingram, after what we just learned, are you sure you want to go to that dinner tonight? Abel pocketed the key, his jaw set with determination. I need to keep up appearances until we know exactly what we're dealing with. But first, let's see what Dr. Benton thought was worth dying for. The weight of the key in his pocket felt like a ticking bomb as he left the diner, knowing that whatever they found in that storage unit would change not just his life, but potentially the lives of countless other families who had no idea they were all pawns in Betty and Sylvia's elaborate game of social engineering. Abel sat across from the distinguished lawyer, watching as he methodically reviewed the evidence compiled over the past 2 weeks. The manila folder spread across the mahogany desk contained surveillance photos, medical records, and detailed reports from both investigators. Ignacio removed his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. If what you're showing me is true, Abel, this goes far beyond a simple case of medical malpractice. This is systematic fraud on an unprecedented scale. That's why I came to you, Abel replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. Your daughters were conceived at Sylvia's clinic, weren't they? The lawyer's hand froze midway through reaching for another document. His normally composed features tightened almost imperceptibly. How did you? The timing matches. Your wife was featured in Boston Magazine's Miracle Mothers spread the same year as Allison. The article mentioned Sylvia's clinic, though not by name. Ignacio stood and walked to his office window, gazing out at the city skyline. The twins were our miracle. After years of trying, he turned back to Abel, his expression hardened. You're certain about the DNA manipulation? Abel pulled out Corey Marr's latest report. We need a genetic researcher to confirm the patterns we're seeing. Someone who understands this kind of fraud and can testify if needed. Do you know anyone? A slight smile crossed Ignacio's face. As a matter of fact, I do. Shelley Woodward. She's been investigating fertility fraud cases in Europe for years. She actually reached out to me 6 months ago about irregularities she'd noticed in several Boston cases, but I didn't have enough evidence to pursue it then. He pressed the intercom on his desk. Sandra, give me Dr. Woodward's contact information in London. And clear my afternoon. Mr. Ingram and I have work to do. 3 days later, Abel sat in a secure video conference room at Ignacio's law firm, watching Dr. Shelley Woodward's face on the large screen as she examined the DNA analysis reports they'd sent. This is remarkable, she said, her British accent crisp and professional. The genetic markers show a clear pattern. Mr. Lawrence's DNA signature appears in at least 7 different families' children, all born within a 5-year period at Sylvia's clinic. She shuffled through some papers off-screen. And you say none of these families selected him as a donor? They all believed they were getting anonymous donors, Ignacio confirmed. Different donors, supposedly carefully screened and matched to specific criteria. The level of coordination required for this. Shelley shook her head. It's sophisticated. Much more so than the cases I've investigated in Eastern Europe. This wasn't opportunistic fraud. It was strategic. Abel leaned forward. What do you mean? Look at the families involved, Shelley explained, pulling up a chart. Banking executives, medical board members, university trustees, arts patrons. These weren't random targets. Someone was deliberately creating genetic connections between specific power centers in Boston society. Betty and Sylvia, Abel murmured. They've been engineering this for decades. Mr. Ingram, Shelley said carefully, if you're willing to work with me, I believe we can expose not just what happened in Boston, but a much larger network of fertility fraud across Europe and America. But I have to warn you, the people behind this will fight back hard. They have everything to lose. Abel thought of his daughters, of all the other children who had been conceived as part of this scheme. What do you need from me? Everything you have on the clinic's operations, especially any connections to European fertility centers. And, she hesitated, we'll need DNA samples from your daughters. Legally obtained, with proper chain of custody documentation. Ignacio stepped in. I can help with that. As their father, Abel has the right to pursue medical testing for his minor children. Their dance instructor mentioned a traveling competition in New York next month, Abel said slowly. They'll need updated physicals. I can arrange for the samples to be taken then. Carefully, Ignacio warned. If Allison or Betty suspect anything, they won't, Abel assured him. I've learned to play my part well these past weeks. That evening, as Abel drove home through Boston's crowded streets, his mind raced with plans and contingencies. The weight of what they were undertaking pressed down on him like a physical force. His phone buzzed with a text from Allison. Don't forget, board dinner tonight at the Sextons. Sylvia's making a special announcement about the art center. He texted back a quick acknowledgement, then pulled over to make a call. Dr. Woodward? There's going to be a gathering tonight. Key players will be there. What exactly should I be looking for? Shelley's voice came through crisp and clear. Connections, Mr. Ingram. Who speaks to whom? Who seems nervous? Who's trying too hard to appear casual? These people have been orchestrating lies for decades. They'll have tells if you know what to watch for. The Sexton's mansion in Brookline was lit up like a Christmas display, elegant cars lining the circular driveway. Abel handed his keys to the valet, straightened his tie, and prepared to step back into the world of secrets and lies he'd been born into, but no longer belonged to. Inside, the city's elite mingled and laughed, oblivious to the truth that threatened to shatter their carefully curated lives. Abel watched as Sylvia held court in the center of her grand salon, her perfectly coiffed silver hair catching. Abel, darling, Sylvia called out, beckoning him over. I was just telling everyone about the innovative design elements you're incorporating into the art center. The acoustic engineering is revolutionary, isn't it? He smiled and played along. Discussing architectural details while his trained, I noticed how she kept glancing at her phone, how her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her wine glass. Something had her rattled. Across the room, he spotted Allison deep in conversation with James Laurent, who must have flown in from Paris for the occasion. The sight of them together, now that he knew the truth, made his stomach turn. But he kept his expression pleasant, even as he noticed how James's features were mirrored in his daughter's faces. Betty appeared at his elbow, her social mask firmly in place. "Abel, I've been meaning to discuss the dedication ceremony plans with you. Shall we step into Howard's study for a moment?" He followed her into the book-lined room, noting how she closed the door carefully behind them. "Is everything all right, Betty? You seem tense." His mother-in-law's carefully constructed facade cracked slightly. "I know you've been meeting with Ignacio Russell," she said quietly. "Whatever you think you've discovered, whatever you're planning, please think about the consequences. Not just for our family, but for all the families involved." Abel kept his voice steady, even as his heart raced. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Ignacio is handling the legal aspects of the Arts Center contract." Betty's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me, Abel. I've spent decades managing situations like this. Do you really think we wouldn't notice you hiring investigators? Meeting with that troublemaker Shelley Woodward." The confirmation that they were watching him sent a chill down his spine, but he maintained his composure. "You seem to have given this a lot of thought, Betty. Is there something specific you're worried about?" Before she could respond, the study door opened and Sylvia entered, closing it quietly behind her. "I think what Betty is trying to say, Abel, is that we're willing to make a deal. One that would benefit everyone involved." "Everyone?" Abel asked mildly. "Or just the people who've been pulling the strings all these years?" Sylvia's smile was razor-sharp. "Don't be naive. The work we've done has created connections that have benefited this city immeasurably. Think about it, the philanthropic networks, the business alliances, the political influence, all carefully cultivated through generations of strategic partnerships." "You mean through lies?" Abel said softly. "Through manipulating people's most intimate decisions without their knowledge or consent." "We gave them what they wanted," Betty interjected. "Children, success, power. Everything we did was to strengthen the social fabric of this city and make yourselves the master weavers," Abel noted. "How many families, Betty? How many children are out there who don't know the truth about their origins?" "Enough," Sylvia cut in. "Here's our offer. Walk away from whatever case you're building. Continue with the Art Center project. Maintain your perfect life with Allison and the girls. In return, we'll ensure your firm's continued success, including some very lucrative international contracts we can arrange through James's connections." Abel looked between the two women who had orchestrated so much manipulation, who had played God with countless lives. "And if I decline? Then we'll have no choice but to protect what we've built," Betty said, her voice hard. "Remember, Abel, you're not the only one who can hire investigators." The threat hung in the air between them. Abel straightened his tie. "Thank you for clarifying the situation," he said calmly. "Shall we rejoin the party? I believe you had a special announcement to make, Sylvia." As they returned to the main room, Abel caught Ignacio's eye across the crowd and gave a slight nod. The lawyer immediately pulled out his phone and stepped onto the terrace, no doubt contacting Shelley. The game was fully in play now, and Abel had just confirmed exactly what they were up against. The private terminal at Logan International Airport hummed with quiet efficiency as Abel watched James Lawrent's private jet taxi toward the runway. The French art dealer had departed Boston after a week of gallery business, leaving behind a web of connections that Corey Marr's team was now meticulously mapping. "His company's financials are fascinating," Lisa Lutz said, sliding a folder across the cafe table. The investment banker's crisp business suit and perfect manicure projected corporate respectability, but her eyes held a haunted look. "The galleries are profitable, but there's a pattern of large international wire transfers that don't match any legitimate art sales." Abel studied the documents. After weeks of careful investigation, they discovered that Lisa, James's sister, was looking for a way out of the scheme she'd helped manage. These transfers, they coincide with the opening of new fertility clinics? Lisa nodded, glancing nervously around the nearly empty cafe. James uses the art world as cover. Gallery openings provide the perfect opportunity for certain parties to meet, to exchange information, and other things. The paintings aren't the only things being carefully curated and transferred across borders. And you've been handling the financial side? I didn't know at first, Lisa said quietly. When James asked me to help manage the international accounts, I thought it was just about art sales and gallery expansions. But then I started noticing patterns. The same medical equipment companies, the same shell corporations, all connecting back to fertility clinics in major cities. Abel pulled out his phone and pulled up a photo. Do you recognize this woman? Lisa's face paled slightly as she looked at the image of Dora Marks, James's former assistant. Where did you get this? She reached out to us, said she has records. Be careful with Dora, Lisa warned. She knows more than almost anyone about James's operation, but she's unstable. After she figured out what was really happening at the galleries, she started keeping detailed files. James found out and tried to discredit her, made it look like she was embezzling. She had to leave Paris in a hurry. Abel leaned forward. What exactly did she figure out? Lisa took a shaky breath. That the affairs weren't accidents. James, he was recruited, trained to seduce specific women. The pregnancies were carefully timed, coordinated with fake IVF treatments at partner clinics. Dora found the schedules, the travel arrangements, even DNA test results that were never supposed to exist, including Allison, especially Allison. That was one of their crown achievements, placing you, with your architectural firm's connections and social status, with a woman they could control through her mother. Betty and Sylvia had been planning it for years. Abel's mind raced back through his courtship with Allison, seeing all the chance, meetings, and convenient coincidences in a new light. Where is Dora now? Last I heard, she was in Amsterdam. But, Abel. Lisa hesitated. There's something else you should know. James and Allison. Their relationship didn't start in college like everyone thinks. Betty and Sylvia arranged their first meeting when they were teenagers. They've been grooming them both for decades. The revelation hit Abel hard. His entire marriage, his family's origin, all of it had been orchestrated before he'd even met Allison. Why are you telling me all this now, Lisa? She pulled out a USB drive and placed it carefully on the table. Because I found something in the financial records that scared me. Large payments to a private security firm, beginning right after Dr. Benton's death. The same firm has been making regular deposits to accounts belonging to certain Paris police officials. You think they had her killed? I think they're capable of anything to protect their network. And I think they're preparing to deal with threats to their operation. She slid the USB drive closer to him. Everything I've found is on here, account numbers, transaction records, emails. But Abel, if you use this, I need protection. These people, they don't just destroy careers. They destroy lives. Abel pocketed the drive. We have a plan for that. Ignacio and Shelley have been building a case for international law enforcement involvement. We can get you into a witness protection program. Lisa shook her head. Not good enough. They have people everywhere. I need to disappear completely. Start fresh somewhere they can't find me. I might know someone who can help with that, Abel said thoughtfully. But first, I need you to tell me everything you know about James's upcoming schedule. Dora's records. Would they show his pattern of targeting specific families? Better than that, Lisa replied, pulling out her phone. I can show you exactly how they select their targets, groom their marks, and coordinate the whole operation. James isn't just an art dealer with a side business in fertility fraud. He's their international fixer, the one who connects all the pieces across continents. As Lisa began explaining the intricate web of deception that her brother had helped weave, Abel's phone buzzed with a text from Ignacio. Shelley found something. DNA matches in London, Paris, and Vienna, all connected to James. Meeting in my office in an hour, the scope of what they were uncovering was staggering. It wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about dozens, perhaps hundreds of families across multiple countries, all unknowingly connected through an elaborate scheme of genetic manipulation and social engineering. One more thing, Lisa said as they prepared to leave. Watch out for Allison. She's not just a pawn in this. She's been an active participant from the beginning. Those society events she organizes, they're not just social gatherings. They're recruitment opportunities, chances to identify potential targets for the program. Abel thought of all the charity galas, all the board meetings, all the carefully orchestrated social occasions where Boston's elite came together under his wife's expert guidance. How many other families have been selected, manipulated, and drawn into this web of lies. The weight of what he had to do next settled over him like a heavy cloak. It wasn't enough to just expose the truth. He had to dismantle this entire network, piece by carefully constructed piece. And to do that, he would have to disappear himself, become a ghost in the machine he was working to destroy. The secure laptop hummed quietly in the sparsely furnished safe house apartment. Abel watched as Gail Wiley's fingers flew across the keyboard, her dark eyes focused intently on the multiple screens before her. The cybersecurity expert had come highly recommended by Shelley Woodward, and her expertise was proving invaluable. It's not just about erasing your digital footprint, Gail explained, pulling up various databases. It's about creating a new pattern of behavior that makes your disappearance look natural. Financial stress, career uncertainties, subtle signs of personal crisis, all building up to a plausible breaking point. She turned one of the screens toward him. I've already started laying the groundwork. Traces of late-night searches about career changes, therapy options, midlife crisis symptoms. Email drafts never sent to family members expressing doubt and frustration. Credit card charges at bars and hotels that suggest someone struggling with personal demons. Abel studied the fabricated digital breadcrumbs. And you can make all this look authentic? Backdated? Trust me, Gail said with a grim smile. By the time I'm done, even you will question your own stability in the months leading up to your disappearance. A knock at the door made them both tense, but it was just Grant Mason, the investigative journalist they'd contacted. The tall, lanky reporter carried a worn leather messenger bag and had the sharp, hungry look of someone who knew he was onto a career-defining story. I've been reviewing everything you sent, Grant said, pulling out a laptop. The evidence is compelling, but we need to be strategic about how we release it. These people have powerful friends in the media. They'll try to discredit the story, and us if we don't have everything absolutely bulletproof. Abel nodded. That's why we're doing it this way. Once I'm gone, they'll be focused on finding me. Meanwhile, you'll be able to work on the story without drawing attention. What about your firm? Grant asked. The Art Center project? I've been quietly transferring control to my partners, Abel explained. As far as anyone knows, I'm just taking a step back due to personal issues. The project will continue without me. Gail looked up from her screens. Speaking of which, I found something interesting. There's a sustainable architecture firm in Seattle looking to expand. Their digital security is good, but not good enough to keep me out. They're perfect for what we need. Oscar Bright's firm? Abel asked, remembering the research they'd done. Yes, he's been working on innovative community design projects, the kind that could provide cover for other activities. Grant raised an eyebrow. Other activities? Safe houses, Abel explained. Places where other families affected by this fraud can go when they discover the truth. We know there are more victims out there. They'll need help, protection. The journalist made some notes. You've really thought this through. But what about your daughters? Abel's jaw tightened. The hardest part, but they're safer not knowing for now. Betty and Sylvia will make sure no harm comes to them. They're too valuable to the scheme. Actually, Gail interjected, I have someone you should meet. Trudy Green. She's a landscape architect who works with Oscar. Her sister went through Sylvia's clinic. She's been trying to piece together what happened for years, but hit nothing but dead ends. She'll understand what we're doing, and she can help establish your new identity in Seattle. The pieces were falling into place. Abel looked at the dossier Gail had created for his new life. A carefully constructed identity that would allow him to work behind the scenes, helping other families while building the case that would eventually expose everything. Timeline, he asked. 3 days, Gail replied. I've already started laying the digital groundwork for your psychological deterioration. Grant will receive the first batch of evidence anonymously the day after you disappear. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, you'll be established in Seattle with a completely new digital footprint. Grant closed his laptop, and I'll start publishing carefully selected pieces of the story, focusing first on the broader pattern of fertility fraud without revealing the Boston connection. Draw attention to similar cases in Europe, build public interest without tipping our hand about the bigger conspiracy. Abel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline he'd helped shape. The Performing Arts Center was already under construction, its skeleton rising against the evening sky. It would be his last project in this city, but not his final legacy. "Do it," he said quietly. "Start the process. And Gail? Make sure all communications going forward are through the secure channels you've established. Once I'm gone, we can't risk any direct contact that could be traced." As Grant and Gail worked on their respective parts of the plan, Abel thought about the letter he'd written to his daughters, to be delivered years in the future when the truth finally came out. He tried to explain his disappearance, his discoveries, his reasons for leaving. Whether they would understand, he couldn't know. But he had to believe that someday they would learn the whole truth about their family, about the web of lies and manipulation that had brought them into existence. For now, though, he had a disappearance to orchestrate. In 3 days, Abel Ingram, successful architect, devoted husband and father, pillar of Boston society, would cease to exist. In his place would emerge a shadow, working quietly to dismantle the elaborate scheme that had destroyed not just his life, but the lives of countless others. Seattle's autumn rain drummed against the windows of Abel's office in the Sustainable Architecture Complex. 7 years of careful planning, of building a new life while gathering evidence, had transformed him. The beard and glasses he'd adopted helped, but it was the weight of secrets that had truly changed him. A knock on his door made him look up from the latest sustainable housing designs. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Brighton, there are 2 young women here to see you. They don't have an appointment, but..." There was a pause. "They say it's about Boston." Abel's heart stopped for a moment. He'd known this day might come, had prepared for it, but the reality still hit him like a physical blow. "Send them in, Sarah." The door opened, and Abel found himself staring at mirror images of Allison's youth. Kelsey and Christy, now 22, stood before him with their mother's posture and James Lawrence's eyes. Behind them loomed a broad-shouldered man with a detective's watchful gaze. Franklin Rivera, he assumed. "Hello, Dad," Kelsey said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Or should we call you Mr. Brighton now?" Abel gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Please sit down. All of you." He studied their faces, Christy's slight frown so like her mother's, Kelsey's analytical gaze that reminded him painfully of James. "How did you find me?" "Mr. Rivera is very good at his job," Christy answered, perching on the edge of her chair. "Though you didn't make it easy. The sustainable architecture angle was clever, hiding in plain sight while building safe houses for other families." Franklin Rivera stepped forward, his New York accent thick with professional detachment. "Your disappearance was well orchestrated, Mr. Ingram. But there were patterns, sustainable housing projects in cities with connections to Sylvia's clinic network. Once we noticed that it was just a matter of time, and the twins hired you because..." Abel kept his voice calm, professional. "Because we deserved answers," Kelsey cut in. "Because we found the letter you left with Ignacio Russell, to be delivered on our 21st birthday. But it didn't tell us everything, did it? Just enough to make us start asking questions." Abel leaned back in his chair, memories of writing that letter flooding back. The careful balance of truth and protection, the knowledge that someday they would need to know everything. "What exactly did you find?" Christy pulled out a tablet, her fingers dancing across the screen. "We found Johanna Aldrich first. She told us about Betty and Sylvia being sisters. Then we tracked down Lisa Lutz in Vancouver. She filled in some blanks about James Lauron, our biological father. And now we want the whole truth," Kelsey added. "About the fertility clinic, about why you really disappeared, about how many other families are involved." Abel stood and walked to the window, watching the rain trace patterns on the glass. Behind him, he heard Rivera shift position slightly, probably assessing whether he posed any threat to his clients. "Mr. Rivera," Abel said without turning, "would you give us a moment alone? I believe I have some things to discuss with my daughters." He heard the detective hesitate, then the soft murmur of agreement from the twins. The door opened and closed. "Before I tell you everything," Abel said, finally turning back to face them, "I need you to understand something. Everything I did, including leaving, was to protect you while I gathered enough evidence to expose what they'd done. Not just to our family, but to dozens of others." He moved to a painting on the wall and swung it aside, revealing a safe. As he worked the combination, he continued speaking. Your grandmother and Sylvia Sexton have been playing God with people's lives for decades. They didn't just arrange pregnancies. They engineered entire family lines, created genetic connections between powerful families without anyone's knowledge or consent. The safe door opened with a soft click. Abel removed a thick file and a portable hard drive. This contains everything: DNA test results, financial records, witness statements, documentation of their entire network, including proof that you have dozens of half-siblings through James's unauthorized donations to the clinic. Kelsey took the file with trembling hands. Half-siblings? How many? At least 30 that we've confirmed. All born to prominent families who used Sylvia's clinic, all believing they had chosen anonymous donors. Abel watched as they began flipping through the documents. James wasn't just a random donor. He was carefully selected and groomed for his role. Your mother's relationship with him wasn't accidental. It was arranged by Betty and Sylvia years before I met her. Christy looked up sharply. Mom knew? All this time? She was part of it from the beginning. The society events she organized, the charity functions, they were all opportunities to identify potential families for the program. Abel sat back down heavily. When I discovered the truth, I had a choice. Confront them directly and risk them burying everything, or disappear and work to expose the whole operation. And the Performing Arts Center? Kelsey asked. Was that part of their scheme too? Everything was connected. The board positions, the social networks, the business dealings, all carefully orchestrated to maintain their control. Abel gestured to the hard drive. That contains digital records going back decades. Dr. Molly Benton started collecting evidence before they killed her, and others have been adding to it since then. Clinic staff, former patients, people who started noticing patterns. The twins exchanged glances, years of unspoken questions hovering between them. Finally, Christy spoke. Show us everything. We need to know who we really are. For the next 3 hours, Abel walked them through the entire story. The discovery of the conspiracy, the careful gathering of evidence, the network of safe houses he'd built to protect other families. He showed them proof of their connection to other prominent Boston families, explained how Betty and Sylvia had manipulated genetic lines to create powerful alliances. So what happens now? Kelsey asked finally, her voice hoarse from hours of questions. Abel looked at his daughters, really looked at them, seeing not just echoes of their parents, but strong, determined young women who deserve to know their own truth. That depends on you. I've spent 7 years building a case that could expose everything. But moving forward means destroying the world you grew up in, affecting families who may not be ready for the truth. They deserve to know, Christy said firmly. All of them, the half-siblings, the parents, everyone who was manipulated by this scheme. Kelsey nodded in agreement. We'll help you. Whatever it takes to expose the truth. Abel felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Not the whole burden, but enough to let him breathe more freely. Then let's call Mr. Rivera back in. We have some plans to make. As he moved to the door, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. Not Abel Ingram, the successful architect. Not David Brighton, the sustainable housing designer. But finally, simply, a father ready to help his daughters uncover the truth about their legacy. The Boston Globe's headline screamed across every newsstand in the city. Elite fertility clinic exposed in decades-long genetic manipulation scheme. Jen Drew's byline led into a devastating expose that sent shockwaves through New England's highest social circles. In her private hospital room, Betty Muller's trembling hands could barely hold the newspaper. The stroke had left her right side weakened, but her mind was sharp enough to recognize the beginning of the end. Kelsey and Christy sat by her bedside, watching their grandmother's carefully maintained facade crumble. I suppose, Betty said, her speech slightly slurred. You want to know everything now? We know most of it, Kelsey replied quietly. About you and Sylvia being sisters, about James being our real father, about how you engineered Mom's whole life. What we want to know is why. Betty's laugh was hollow, empty of its usual social polish. Why? Because power isn't just about money or position. It's about connections, blood connections. Sylvia and I learned that from our mother, and she learned it from hers. The monitors beeped steadily as Betty shifted in her bed. It started in the 1950s. Our grandmother realized that the old Boston families were losing their grip on power. New money was coming in, diluting the bloodlines, changing the social order. She saw fertility treatments as a way to guide things back on course. By playing God with people's lives, Christie's voice held an edge of anger. By ensuring the right connections were made, Betty corrected. The right genetic materials preserved and distributed. The right marriages arranged through carefully orchestrated social interactions. She closed her eyes briefly. Your mother was one of our greatest successes. We groomed her from childhood, arranged her first meeting with James when they were teenagers, cultivated their connection. And Dad? Kelsey prompted. Where did he fit in? Abel was perfect, ambitious, talented, socially connected through his firm. We needed his architectural connections, his influence in urban development. The fertility clinic gave us medical control, but we needed someone who could shape the physical environment where power operates. The twins watched as their grandmother's social mask slipped further, revealing the calculated manipulator beneath. It wasn't just Boston, Betty continued. Sylvia expanded internationally, using James's art galleries as cover. We created a network of clinics, each contributing to our larger vision. The Performing Arts Center was meant to be our crowning achievement, a physical monument to our influence over the city. How many families? Christie asked. How many lives did you manipulate? Hundreds over the years. Some knew parts of it, like your mother, like James. Others were completely unaware. We created connections between banking families and political dynasties, between old money and new technology fortunes. Betty's voice grew stronger as she warmed to her subject. Every major development project, every board appointment, every significant social initiative in Boston for the past 30 years has been shaped by the relationships we engineered. A nurse appeared in the doorway with medication, but Kelsey waved her away. Keep talking, grandmother. Tell us about Dr. Bennon. About what happened in Paris. Betty's face tightened. Molly was brilliant, but she couldn't see the bigger picture. She started asking questions, comparing genetic records, noticing patterns. She didn't understand that some knowledge is too dangerous to expose. So you had her killed, Christie said flatly. We protected what we'd spent generations building. Betty's stroke-affected hand clutched at the hospital blanket. Sylvia handled it. She always handled the messier aspects. The monitors showed Betty's heart rate increasing. You don't understand what we achieved. We didn't just arrange pregnancies. We shaped society itself. Every major hospital board, every university trustees meeting, every significant charitable foundation in this city is connected through bloodlines we designed. And now it's all coming down, Kelsey observed, pulling out her phone to show her grandmother the latest headlines. Jen Drew's article is just the beginning. More journalists are picking up the story. Families are demanding DNA tests. The FBI is investigating the international connections. Betty's face crumpled as she read the updates. Sylvia, has she gone into hiding? Christie confirmed. But it won't help. Johanna Aldrich saved copies of everything. Patient records, donor profiles, financial transactions. It's all coming out, grandmother. All of it. The monitors began beeping more urgently as Betty's blood pressure spiked. You don't know what you're destroying, she gasped. The carefully balanced networks, the alliances we built. Everything will fall apart. No, Kelsey said firmly. What's falling apart is the web of lies you and Sylvia wove. The truth is coming out, and yes, it will hurt. But these families deserve to know who they really are, who their children really... Betty's next words were cut off as medical staff rushed in, responding to her deteriorating vitals. As the twins were ushered out of the room, they heard their grandmother calling out names and dates, a litany of secrets spilling forth as her careful control finally shattered. In the hospital corridor, Christie turned to her sister. Do you think she'll ever understand what they did wrong? Kelsey shook her head. To her and Sylvia, it was all just a grand social engineering project. They really believed they were shaping a better society. By playing God with people's lives, Christie murmured, echoing her earlier words. Their phones buzzed simultaneously. News alerts showing Sylvia's clinic being raided by federal agents. Interviews with shell-shocked Boston socialites discovering their children's true parentage. International headlines about the fertility fraud network spanning continents. The house of cards was falling, and buried beneath its collapse were decades of secrets, lies, and carefully orchestrated deceptions. But for the twins, watching their grandmother's empire crumble, there was a strange sense of liberation. The truth, however painful, was finally emerging into the light. The Performing Arts Center gleamed in the late afternoon sun, its innovative design a testament to the architectural vision of the man who had disappeared 7 years ago. Boston's elite filled the grand entrance hall, gathered for what was supposed to be a triumphant opening night. Instead, they whispered behind program books and champagne flutes, eyeing each other with new suspicion as they wondered whose children were really whose. Kelsey and Christy stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching James Laurent arrive with his French wife, Tiffany Fleming. He moved with the same casual grace that had made him such an effective operative in Betty and Sylvia's scheme, seemingly unaffected by the scandal erupting around him. "Ready?" Kelsey asked her sister, gripping the file folder that contained irrefutable proof of their father's activities. Christy nodded, her jaw set with determination. It's time he faced what he did. Not just to us, but to all of them. They descended the stairs just as their mother, Allison, rushed to intercept them. "Girls, please," she hissed, her social smile strained. "Don't make a scene. We can discuss this privately." "No more privacy," Christy cut her off. "No more secrets. Everything comes out tonight." James saw them approaching and froze, recognition flickering across his features. Tiffany noticed his reaction and frowned. "James? What's wrong?" "Hello, Father," Kelsey said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly hushed foyer. Or should we say donor number 274? The surrounding conversations died as Boston's social elite turned to watch the drama unfold. James maintained his smooth facade, though his knuckles whitened on his champagne glass. "This isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," Christy interrupted, opening the file. "Right here, in the building our real father designed. The father you and Mom and Grandmother drove away with your lies." Tiffany's face had drained of color. "James? What are they talking about?" "Show her," Kelsey said, handing over DNA test results. "Show her how your art galleries were just fronts for an international fertility fraud scheme. Show her the records of how many children you actually fathered through Sylvia's clinic." The whispers grew louder as more people gathered around. Among them, the twins recognized faces from the files. Parents who had used the clinic, children who shared James's DNA, families whose lives had been orchestrated without their knowledge. "It wasn't like that," James protested, his accent thickening under stress. "Everything was done to benefit." "To benefit who?" Christy demanded. "The children who don't know their true parentage? The families who were manipulated into false relationships? The mothers who were deceived about their donors?" Allison stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "Please understand, we were trying to create meaningful connections. By lying," Kelsey's voice cracked with emotion. "By arranging affairs and manipulating DNA records. By killing anyone who threatened to expose the truth." A gasp went through the crowd at this accusation. Tiffany staggered back from her husband, the DNA results trembling in her hands. "Mon Dieu, how many? How many children?" 37 confirmed so far, Christy answered. "All from prominent families who used Sylvia's clinic. All believing they had chosen anonymous donors. All actually receiving DNA from the man Betty and Sylvia had selected to help create their perfect genetic network." James finally dropped his sophisticated veneer. "You don't understand what we accomplished. The connections we created, the power networks we established. Save it for the federal investigators." A new voice cut through the tension. Lisa Lutz emerged from the crowd, flanked by FBI agents. "I've already told them everything, James. About the financial networks, the clinic connections, all of it." James's face contorted with rage. "You betrayed your own family." "I chose truth over conspiracy," Lisa interrupted. "I chose to help these families understand what was done to them without their knowledge or consent." The federal agents moved forward as the crowd parted. James looked wildly around, perhaps for an escape route, but found himself surrounded by the very social elite he had helped manipulate for decades. "James Laurent," the lead agent announced, You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, international money laundering, and participation in an illegal genetic manipulation scheme. As the agents led James away, Tiffany collapsed into a nearby chair, still clutching the DNA reports. Allison stood frozen, her carefully maintained social persona crumbling as she watched her carefully constructed world fall apart. "Mom," Kelsey said quietly, "it's over. All the lies, all the manipulation, it ends tonight." Allison's response was cut off by a commotion at the entrance. The crowd turned to see Abel Ingram walking into the Performing Arts Center he had designed. 7 years had changed him, but there was no mistaking his presence. The whispers grew to a dull roar as he made his way through the crowd toward his daughters. "Dad," Christy whispered, moving to embrace him. Abel held his daughters close, then faced his former wife. "Hello, Allison. You planned this," she accused, her voice shaking. "All of it. The evidence, the arrests, the public exposure." "No," Abel corrected her. "I planned for the truth. Everything else was a consequence of your own choices. Yours and Betty's and Sylvia's and James's." The sound of camera shutters filled the air as press photographers captured the scene. Jen Drew, who had broken the story, stood at the edge of the crowd, recording every word for what would become a Pulitzer-winning series of articles. 1 year later, sunlight streamed through the windows of Abel's Seattle office as he reviewed plans for the Genetic Research Center and Family Counseling Facility. The settlement money from the civil suits against the fertility clinic had funded this new project, a place where families affected by the fraud could find support, understanding, and resources. The door opened, and Trudy Green entered with their adopted daughter, Hope. At 4 years old, Hope was too young to understand the complex circumstances that had brought her into their family. But someday, she would know she was part of a larger story of truth and healing. "The twins are arriving tomorrow," Trudy said, smiling. "They're bringing some of their half-siblings. They want to talk about expanding the support network." Abel touched the family photo on his desk. Not the old one from his previous life, but a new one showing him with Trudy, Hope, the twins, and several of the half-siblings they had connected with over the past year. It wasn't a perfect family in the way Betty and Sylvia had tried to engineer, but it was real, built on honesty and acceptance rather than manipulation and lies. Sometimes, he reflected, looking at the photo, the greatest legacies are built not from what we create, but from what we choose to expose and heal. Outside his window, construction continued on additional buildings for their expanding support network. The Performing Arts Center in Boston had been renamed and repurposed as a center for medical ethics, while Kelsey and Christy had chosen to study bioethics, determined to help prevent similar frauds from happening again. The truth had cost them their comfortable illusions, their social standing, and their carefully constructed family narratives. But it had given them something far more valuable: authenticity, purpose, and the chance to help other families navigate the complex emotions of discovering their own truths. As Abel watched Hope playing with her toys on his office floor, he thought about legacy. Not the architectural monuments he had once dreamed of leaving behind, but the foundation of truth and healing they were building together. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was real, honest, and ultimately more meaningful than any carefully engineered social network could ever be. The sound of laughter from the courtyard drew his attention. A group of teenagers, some of them recently discovered half-siblings, were gathering for one of the support center's youth programs. Among them, he recognized faces that bore subtle resemblances to James, living proof of the far-reaching consequences of the fertility clinic schemes. But these young people weren't defined by the circumstances of their conception or the lies that had surrounded their births. Instead, they were forging their own connections, building genuine relationships based on shared experiences and mutual understanding. This, Abel realized, was his true legacy. Not the buildings he designed, not the secrets he exposed, but the healing community that had emerged from the ashes of deception. In choosing truth over comfort, exposure over concealment, they had all found something more valuable than social position or carefully curated bloodlines. They had found authenticity, and in that authenticity, they had found real family. Epilogue. 10 years later. The French Riviera's pristine beaches held little charm for Allison Ritter as she sat alone at a small cafe in Nice, watching tourists stroll past. At 55, her carefully maintained appearance couldn't quite hide the toll of the past decade. The newspaper on her table carried yet another story about the ongoing implications of the fertility clinic scandal. International Fertility Fraud Network. 10 years later, new victims still coming forward. She took a sip of her now-cold coffee, remembering the days when she had been the toast of Boston society. Now, she lived off a modest allowance from what remained of her family's fortune after the lawsuits, criminal penalties, and civil settlements. The iconic Beacon Hill home had been sold to help pay legal fees, its contents auctioned to compensate victims of the fertility scheme. "Your usual lunch, Madame Ritter?" the waiter asked in accented English. "Just the salad today, Pierre," she replied, quickly turning the newspaper face down. Even here, 3,000 miles from Boston, she couldn't escape the shadows of her past. Her phone buzzed, a text from Kelsey. "Mom, we're giving a talk at Harvard Medical School next week about ethical implications in reproductive medicine. Will you finally come? It's time to face this." Allison's hand trembled as she set the phone down without responding. Her daughters, now 32, had become leading voices in medical ethics, their personal story lending weight to their academic work. They maintained minimal contact with her, their messages usually related to their professional work or major life events. Last year, they'd informed her of their decision to legally change their surname to Ingram. A few tables away, she spotted a familiar figure, James Laurent, now aged beyond his years, dining alone. Their eyes met briefly before both quickly looked away. Their passionate affair, once the stuff of romance, had been exposed as a calculated manipulation, their great love story nothing but a scientific experiment in genetic engineering. James had served 3 years in federal prison for his role in the fertility fraud scheme. His art empire had crumbled, his galleries sold or shuttered. His wife Tiffany had divorced him immediately after the scandal broke, taking their young son to London. The cruel irony wasn't lost on either of them. The child James had actually raised as his own wanted nothing to do with him, while dozens of his biological children, conceived through the clinic's fraud, had formed their own support network. The latest news from Boston still reached Allison through old social connections. Betty had passed away 2 years after her stroke, her hospital room confessions having provided prosecutors with crucial evidence. Sylvia had fled to a country without extradition, but her attempt to access hidden accounts had led to her capture in Singapore. She was currently serving a 20-year sentence. Lisa Lutz, whose testimony had been instrumental in unraveling the international network, had rebuilt her life in Canada under witness protection. Her cooperation had led to the exposure of similar schemes in clinics across Europe and Asia. The investigation had ultimately implicated over 40 fertility clinics worldwide. Back in her small rented apartment overlooking the Mediterranean, Allison opened her laptop to the bookmark she visited almost daily, the website for the Center for Reproductive Truth and Healing in Seattle. The organization that Abel and Trudy had built had grown into an international resource for families affected by fertility fraud. Abel's architectural vision had evolved from designing buildings to creating spaces for healing. The Seattle complex now included counseling centers, research facilities, and community spaces. The twins often worked there, running programs for half-siblings discovering their connections. The website showed recent photos of Abel and Trudy at the opening of their newest facility in London. Their daughter Hope, now 14, stood proudly between them. Allison clicked through the photo gallery, pausing at images of the repurposed Boston Performing Arts Center. The building she'd once imagined as her family's crowning social achievement now housed the International Institute for Medical Ethics. Its walls, originally meant to showcase artistic performances, instead displayed a permanent exhibition documenting the fertility clinic scandal and its global impact. Dear Kelsey and Christy, after 10 years of running from the truth, I'm ready to accept your invitation. You deserve to hear my full story, not excuses, but an honest account of how I became involved in your grandmother and aunt's scheme. More importantly, you deserve to know that despite the lies surrounding your conception, my love for you was always real. Across the ocean, in the Seattle Center's main conference room, Abel sat with a group of newly discovered half-siblings, all in their early 30s, all conceived through James's manipulated donations. The support group had grown beyond just the Boston families. Participants now came from Paris, London, Vienna, and other cities where the clinic's network had operated. The hardest part, one young woman was saying, isn't just learning about our biological father. It's realizing that our parents' entire relationships might have been engineered. How do we trust anything about our own identities? Abel noticed Trudy slip quietly into the room. After a decade of running these sessions, she had an intuitive sense of when her perspective as both a family member of a victim and now part of the support network would be valuable. Identity isn't just about genetics, Trudy said, joining the circle. It's about the choices we make, the truths we choose to face, and how we help others heal. Later that evening, Abel sat in his home office, reviewing applications for the center's expanding international program. A photo on his desk showed Kelsey and Christy at their Harvard Medical School graduation, both now respected researchers in bioethics. Next to it stood a picture of Hope's recent art show. Her installations dealt with themes of identity, truth, and the meaning of family. His phone lit up with a message from Ignacio Russell, who had become one of the world's leading advocates for fertility fraud legislation. New case in Melbourne. Similar pattern to Boston. Could use your team's expertise. Before Abel could respond, another message arrived. This one from Randolph Ramsey, the investigator who'd helped uncover the truth 10 years ago. Now running a specialized agency focusing on fertility fraud cases, Ramsey had become a crucial ally in helping other families uncover similar schemes. Found something interesting in the old clinic records, Ramsey's message read. More connections to European medical boards. Looks like Sylvia's network went deeper than we thought. Can we meet? Abel glanced at the family photo taken at last year's Christmas gathering. Dozens of faces, many bearing subtle resemblances to each other, all part of the extended family that had grown from the ashes of deception. Half-siblings, their spouses, their children, all connected not just by genetics but by their shared journey toward truth. The sound of laughter drifted up from the garden, where Hope was teaching art therapy techniques to a group of younger children, all from families affected by the fertility fraud. The teens had dubbed themselves the Truth Generation, determined to transform their complicated legacy into something positive. Trudy appeared in his office doorway. Kelsey called. Allison finally responded. She's coming to their Harvard talk. Abel nodded slowly. After all these years, do you think she's really ready to face everything? People could surprise you, Trudy replied. Look at Lisa. Who would have thought James's sister would become one of our strongest allies? Or that Johanna would end up running our international documentation project? She was right. The decade had brought unexpected transformations. Dr. Sandy Richard, who had once destroyed records for Sylvia, now worked with their legal team, helping other clinics identify potential fraud patterns. Even some of James's legitimate art world connections had proven valuable, helping them track down families across Europe. The next morning, Abel stood at his office window, watching more families arrive for the center's weekly support sessions. A decade ago, he'd thought exposing the truth would be the end of the story. Instead, it had been just the beginning of a longer journey, one of healing, reconciliation, and redefining the meaning of family. His desk calendar showed upcoming events. A genetic ethics conference in London where the twins would be keynote speakers, the opening of a new support center in Melbourne, Hope's international art therapy program launch, and most significantly, the 10-year anniversary symposium at the Boston Institute for Medical Ethics. The transformed performing arts center that now stood as a monument to truth rather than deception. The fertility fraud scandal had shattered countless illusions, destroyed carefully constructed social networks, and exposed decades of manipulation. But from that devastation had emerged something authentic, a community built on truth, support, and the understanding that Real family transcends genetic engineering and social schemes. As Abel prepared for another day of helping families navigate their new realities, he reflected on the long journey from that first overheard conversation at a Boston party to the international healing network they'd built. The price of truth had been high, but its value was beyond measure. In his personal journal, kept since the day he'd first discovered the fertility clinic's deception, Abel wrote, 10 years after choosing truth over comfort, exposure over concealment, we continue to discover new layers to this story. Each revelation brings both pain and healing. Each connection forms another thread in this tapestry of authentic family we're weaving. While Betty and Sylvia tried to engineer the perfect society through deception, we're building something far more meaningful through honesty and acceptance. The Performing Arts Center they meant as their crowning achievement now stands as a center for truth and ethics. The social networks they carefully constructed have been replaced by genuine communities of support. And the families they tried to manipulate have found real connections, stronger than any engineered genetic links. Sometimes the most important legacies are built not from what we create or control, but from what we choose to reveal and heal. In exposing the truth, we lost our carefully constructed perfect lives, but we gained something far more valuable: authenticity, purpose, and real family bonds formed through shared healing rather than shared deception. As I watch Hope work with other children of the fertility fraud, as I see Kelsey and Christy transform their personal pain into professional purpose, as I witness new families discover their connections and work through their truths, I know that choosing honesty over comfort was worth every sacrifice. The echoes of truth continue to ripple outward, touching more lives, revealing more connections, and helping more families find their way from deception to authenticity. This is the real legacy we're building, not through careful manipulation of genetics and social status, but through the brave and honest work of healing together. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.